Good evening, and on behalf of the director, Susan Weber, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's installment of the seminar in cultural history at the Bard Graduate Center. The welcome is extended to all of you here in the room and to those of you out there somewhere else in the world or in the future looking back at us tonight on BBC TV. And with that, I would like to acknowledge all civic, intellectual, and social life of the Bard Graduate Center here on West 86th Street on the island of Manhattan unfolds on the ancient and present homelands of the Lenni Lenape people. Tonight, our speaker is Isabelle Kalinowski, who's professor of German Studies at the Ecole Normale Supérieure in Paris. Her PhD at the University of Paris was on the history of Hölderlin reception in France from 1925 to 67, and she habilitated with a thesis on Max Weber from sociology to the anthropology of religions. Since 2012, she's been a professor in the Laboratoire Germanique at the Ecole Normale. From 2017, she has served as co-director of the Cambridge Humanities Research Grant, Entangled Histories, Archaeology, Interiors, Design, 1750 to 1900, and that's been with Caroline Van Eck, with Patricia Falguière, and Nathan Schlanger. Since 2018, she has been the head of the Laboratoire for Pays Germanique at the Ecole Normale, and also since 2018, she has been the head, this is a lot of administrative work, I empathize, of the graduate program Transliterae, which has been conducted through this new conglomeration, PSL, Paris Sciences et Lettres. Her main interest is the history of German sociology and anthropology of religion, focusing on the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and in particular the relationship between the arts and the cultural sciences. Key figures for her are Max Weber, Gottfried Semper, Karl Einstein, and Franz Boas. Her last publication, in fact, is an anthology of Karl Einstein's writings on aesthetics, Vivante Figure, just published in 2019. With a team of art historians, curators, and archaeologists, she's currently preparing a French edition of Semper's style. And I would say that for our own purposes here, Semper is a key figure, not only for the obvious reasons of his work on ornament and style, but for the way in which in his work we see how these kinds of canonically art historical categories are in fact woven into a much richer tissue of the cultural sciences, reaching out towards historical, anthropological, sociological, and theological, religious and ritual elements. He could be, along with somebody like Ebi Warburg, one of our ancient patron saints. And on that holy note, I am happy to turn the floor over to Isabelle Kalinowski.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to express my deep gratitude to Dean Peter Miller and to the Bard Graduate Center for this kind of invitation. It's a great opportunity for me to be here and to share my reflections on Gottfried Semper with all of you. So thank you for your presence. Before I begin my presentation, I just want to present myself and to precise that I'm not an art historian, but a Germanist. I work on German texts on the second half of the 19th century or of the first decades of the 20th century, more precisely on German texts on anthropology of religion and art. My approach consists in a close reading of texts. I'm trying to reconstruct the ways of their argumentations and to define precisely their logical structure. The goal of my presentation today will therefore not be to analyze if Gottfried Semper was right or not, but to describe rigorously the logic of his thinking. In this communication, I will quote abundantly Semper's English translations. So, Semper's style. This style, whose first volume was published in 1860, was translated into English in 2004 by Harry Francis Malgrave in the collections of the Getty Research Institute. And I'll be quoting a lot from this translation, as well as Malgrave's earlier translation of The Four Elements of Architecture and other essays, published in 1989. I'm currently preparing with my French colleague Estelle Thibault, a historian of architecture, a translation of Semper's style into French. So now I come to my introduction. The famous thesis of German architect Gottfried Semper on the relationship between textile and architecture is founded on a demonstration which he based on two important theoretical steps. The first step was the discovery of traces of polychromy on ancient architecture. Before Semper, who was enthusiastic about this new finding, architect Jacob Ignaz Hittorf, here in a sketch by Ingres, had observed traces of color on the rails and columns of the temple of Selinunte in Sicily in the mid-1820s. From 1830 to 1833, it was Semper's turn to go to the south of France. These slides are Hittorf's publications, and now it's a dessin of Semper. So Semper went to the south of France, to the south of Italy, to Sicily and to Athens in order to verify by himself the reality of Hittorf's statement that the marbles and stones of ancient Greek temples were not as white as the ancient statues depicted by Winkelmann. Semper confirmed that the most magnificent stones of ancient ruins often displayed traces of polychrome pigments. Back to Germany in 1834, he published a first essay, which was a vibrant plea for the polychrome party, the preliminary remarks on polychrome architecture and sculpture. It's the cover of this book. His main goal was not to offer an historical reconstitution, nor a modern architectural imitation of the impressive red and blue backgrounds which he imagined on the ancient buildings. You can see on this slide Semper's reconstitution of a red Parthenon. What he had in mind was something else. Polychromy was, according to him, a sign, evidence of the functions of architectonic elements, especially walls, ceilings, floors, roofs, columns, etc. He related the use of color in architecture to specific functions of architecture, which in 1834 he was not yet able to define, but which he wanted to unravel. The historical existence of polychromy had to be demonstrated, but for Semper it was not enough. His main interest was to explain the role of color and to find an interpretation for the necessity of the decor. 15 years later, Semper found the way to the second theoretical major step of his demonstration. He was now able to explain the function of polychromy in ancient architecture. His thesis is that the color put on stone doesn't refer primarily or not exclusively to a symbolic function, for example, to a system of symbols associated with different colors. The function of color is not primarily symbolic, nor it is only decorative. The aesthetic dimension of polychromy is, of course, a major component of what Semper calls style, but it's not the only one. According to Semper, the essential function of polychromy has to do with memory. Polychromy is a reminiscence of an origin which is more structural than strictly historical. From the end of the 1840s onwards, Semper identifies this origin of architecture as textile. He explores his idea much later in his cardinal work, Der Stil, or Style, in 1860, but he formulates his thesis on the textile origin of architecture as early as the late 1840s. This new conception of architecture is groundbreaking for three reasons at least. First, and it will be my first part, Semper postulates a relationship between architectural polychromy and the use of color in ancient textile, especially the juxtaposition of colored parts in rugs and carpets. The treatment of color in the architectural decor is paratactic, and this paratactic structure is precisely a specific feature of textile techniques, like those of rugs, embroideries, or tapestry, as opposed to the mixing of colors which characterize the art of painting. This will be my first point. I will explore the consequences Semper draws from the paratactic nature of architectural color. The second reason is that the relationship between architectural polychromy and textile is related to a specific spatial position, namely the vertical. Architecture has something to do with textile, but more precisely with a specific use of textile, that of hanging textile. The rug, which for Semper is the archetype of house building, is considered not in its more modern ordinary use on a floor, but as a hanging rug. In the verticality of a hanging rug, Semper discovers the prototype of the wall. Consequently, he proposes a completely new architectural definition of the wall based on the specificities of textile verticality. This will be my second point. The third reason is that Semper develops a very innovative way to explain the transition from one material to one another, from textile to another architectural components. I will try to describe in my conclusive remarks the specific properties of this Semperian conception of the relationship between textile and architecture. So I come to my first part, architecture and the paratactical use of color. During his journey in France, Italy, and Greece, one of the first places Semper chose to stop at was the French Roman city of Orange in Provence, where it is sketched and analyzed an ancient Roman mosaic pavement. The technique of mosaic is interesting for Semper because it exemplifies a very pure parataxis of colors. The cut stones or tesserae create perfectly clear lines of separation between the contrasting colors, white, black, but also you can see it on this picture, but these colors are also yellow, green, and red. Semper describes a color power taxis, as an optic phenomenon. The colors are not mixed together on the material surface. They exclude each other, but are simultaneously apprehended together. They are not seen only as separate. The eye is able to mix them while perceiving them as distinct. As seen from a certain distance, the juxtaposition of colors creates a new refined tone. Semper's concept of polychromy, therefore, is based not only on a reflection on the color of architecture, as opposed to a neutral or white image of antique buildings, but also, and more precisely, on a reflection on the plurality of the polychromy, which is not a random mix of colors. For Semper, the confrontation of tones in ancient polychromy was an organized one, conforming to well-defined rules and principles of composition. Colors react to other ones, but these forms of resonance can only be obtained if the power taxis of tones follows certain laws. The discovery of Pompeii to Semper was not only a revelation about the polychromy of ancient decor, but also about the system of colors used in this decor. One of the most striking features was the fresh and vivid tones of the colored surfaces. The ancient, Semper says, never used half tones in their homes and buildings in general. I quote an extract of preliminary remarks on polychrome architecture and sculpture. In a bright, consuming southern light and strongly tinted environment, the effect of refraction on well-ordered tones of color placed next to one another is so mild that the colors do not offend the eye, but soothe it. The secret lies in arranging the colors in such a way as not to harm each other. The recently excavated walls at Pompeii show how adept the ancients were in applying the brilliantly pure colors. And indeed, we begin to become accustomed to them. The ancients, in their decoration, knew no subdued half-tones of color. The blending and mixing took place not on the palette, but on the wall, through the juxtaposition of variegated and graceful decorations that, at a certain distance, appear to the eye as intermixed, but that always retain a tender playfulness that has such a charming effect. The evocation of the recently excavated walls at Pompeii is here characteristic of Semper's approach, which is constantly reflexive and takes into account the historicity of perception. The blending purity of the Pompeian colors contrasts with the conventional image of ancient constructions and their soft and creamy patina, which tends to obliterate the fact that the colors were used as large monochrome surfaces. The appearances of perception have to be rectified by an hermeneutics of the ancient decor, by a science of its interpretation. Semper's concept of vision is therefore historicized and critical. This faculty is not reduced to a passive registration of colored signals. It's always, in a Kantian vein, an interpretation of the perceived objects. Semper insists on the extraordinary creative potential of color associations, and he's not the first one to do so. His thoughts on juxtaposition principle were grounded in a fundamental work first published in 1839, The Principles of Harmony and Contrast of Colors and Their Applications to the Art, with German translation published in 1847, is explicitly quoted by Semper. This book of Michel Eugène Chevreul was entitled in French De la loi du contraste simultané des couleurs et de l'assortiment des objets colorés. Chevreul was a chemist, and he was then director of the dye houses at the Gobelin factory. In the foreword of his study, Chevreul related that many private owners of Gobelin tapestries claimed about the blemishing of certain colors, and he argued that this transformation was not due to a real fading process, but to an optical phenomenon that he analyzes in the book. The consequences of the juxtaposition of colors or of what he called the phenomenon of simultaneous contrast simultané. Chevreul described the incidence of other factors, especially of time and duration of vision, on the effects of colors, and wanted to develop a technique to rationally control these contrasts through the choice of adequate tones. Chevreul's ideas inspired Owen Jones in his project for the polychrome decor of the Crystal Palace in 1851, in which he implemented the system of juxtaposition of large colored surfaces. The fact that Chevreul was a specialist of textile art undoubtedly contributes to explain Semper's strong interest in his theories. But paradoxically, they differ the most precisely in the way they perceive the relationship between the power tactical use of color and textile. To understand their dissension, we must introduce a third term, easel painting. Discussions on the hierarchy of arts and on the respective place of the beaux-arts, namely painting, and of the textile arts is key here. For Chevreul, the laws of simultaneous contrast were primarily formulated for arts like tapestry or stained glass windows, which didn't allow for what the painters call repentir or pentimento. That's to say, new definitions of color and designs, new ways to mix colors and to obtain subtle tones. Such alterations which are always possible in oil painting. The presupposition, therefore, was that the techniques of contrasted colored surfaces were conceived for the applied arts, seen as surrogates to more refined technical artistic achievements like those of the easel or oil painting. Gobelin tapestries were precious for Chevreul, even as surrogates of the great painting or painting in chiaroscuro. He opposed this great painting to a second type of painting, the Asian and especially Chinese painting in flat tones, teinte plate. Chevreul implied not only a historical anteriority of this second type, but also a primacy of easel painting as a reference even for an applied art like tapestry. Semper, on the contrary, looked for a new narrative which was remarkably free from such evolutionary undertones. He was convinced that he had discovered a completely new way of thinking of the genealogy of polychromy and of the relationships between color, painting, and textile. According to him, the power taxis of colors was not a more or less schematic surrogate or primitive ancestor of oil painting. Semper reversed the perspective and argued that easel painting was a derivative and a decadent one of an art which had been the greatest art in ancient times, wall painting. And this reversal was not the only one. Wall painting, in turn, is seen as deriving from a textile prototype. The principle of color juxtaposition originated, Semper argues, in the constraints of the textile decor. The great originality of Semper's theory of polychromy lies in the fact that the vanishing point of his demonstration is not color itself, but textile as focus point of the whole genealogy he is now able to reconstruct. The color power taxis is a sign which refers to something else as an optical combination of monochrome tones, a sign which refers to a genealogy of techniques which is primarily a logical one. Semper finally elucidates the enigma of polychromy. It's the trace of the primacy of textile. The power tactical disposition is in fact not indifferent about its material support. Semper discovers its prototype in a specific textile technique, the use of parallel yarns in Oriental embroidery. Semper's seminal experience was the encounter with the bas-relief of Oriental palaces which were excavated for the first time in the 1840s. Parts of their decor arrived at the Musée du Louvre and at the British Museum precisely during Semper's stay in Paris and London. And he was among the first Europeans to be able to see them at the end of that decade. He was fascinated by the clothes of the Assyrian kings on the stone reliefs, especially their embroidered coats. They were so minutely sculptured that Semper could observe the technique used and conclude that embroidery has reached a high degree of refinement in these ancient Oriental textiles. The principle of this Oriental technique was the parallelism of yarns, which were not crossed as in European embroidery techniques. According to Semper, the difference between these two practices of embroidery accounted for two different types of design. In the first case, that's to say in Oriental and Asian embroidery, the design was more figurative and illustrative. In the second case, the most ancient forms of European embroidery, there was a more abstract, geometrical and decorative design. We should therefore not simplify Semper's conception and claim that he postulates an antagonism between the geometricality of the Oriental decor, as in the design of rugs, and the more figurative decor of European tapestry, for example. For him, the latter is in fact derived from the ancient Oriental embroidery tapestry and from his figurative decor. Semper assumes a historical continuity, or, in his words, a miraculous continuity in the discontinuity from the Assyrian decor to European medieval tapestry. He sees, I quote, the emergence of a pictorial principle in the broad illustrative tone of representation on Assyrian and Babylonian carpets. I quote, this principle recurs in the alabaster reliefs of Nineveh, and then, after many centuries and under totally different social conditions, miraculously reappears almost completely unchanged in the earliest medieval tapestry weavings and canvas paintings. The observation of Chinese embroideries played a crucial role in Semper's discovery. He makes an analogy, or more precisely a confusion, between the Chinese embroideries he was able to contemplate and probably to touch at the London Great Exhibition of 1851 and the Assyrian reliefs he saw at the Louvre and British Museum. I quote Semper, in 1851, I saw example of this art of embroidery at the Great Exhibition in London. They reminded me so much of the well-known bas-relief of Nineveh in their style and treatment that I have since been unable to see the latter as anything other than ancient Assyrian carpet embroidery translated into alabaster. Indeed, similar relief embroideries of a more recent date closely resemble antediluvian Chinese tapestries in their style. This text demonstrates very explicitly that Semper's acception of genealogy is not historical in a literal sense. He thinks not in terms of linear or evolutionist succession. Instead, he draws lines that go back and forth between past and present and past, and between different cultures. We can also notice that he defines these lines as translation processes, like in this text, translated into alabaster. I'll come back to this point later. In the very ancient paratactical technique of flat embroidery, the Chinese didn't only use silk yarns, but also small pieces of monochrome silk fabrics or even feeders. I quote Semper, the frequent reference to feeders indicate that they were used for embroidery. Flat embroidery, still a favorite of contemporary Chinese women, was at the time still opus plumarium in the strict sense of the word. Embroidery took the place of painting and was older than it. If painting is understood to mean more than a simple coating, a kind of color composition executed on surfaces. This is as certain as the fact that wood panels and wallpaper are of a later origin than drapery and woven wool dressing. The oldest Chinese colored embroidery was thus flat stitch, executed on a ground of colored fabric with feeders. Why does Semper insist so vigorously on the Chinese use of feeders? Probably for two reasons. The first one has to do with a technical problem, the transition between surface and volume, or the genealogy of relief. I quote Semper, "The characteristic feature of this feeder embroidery is the flat grandeur of the design over the surface of the material, amounting to a sort of polychrome bas-relief. The thickness of the embroidery creates a relief. In the economy of Semper's demonstration, it hints at the possibility of a textile genealogy, not only of architecture and painting, but also of sculpture. The scope of the textile thesis thus expands considerably, and I'll examine the consequences of this extension in the next section. The second reason why Semper is interested in Chinese feeders is probably the fact that the flat stitch reproduces the natural structure of feeders. Semper doesn't seek to discover a natural basis for art techniques. On the contrary, he is fascinated by the intermingling of nature and art, especially when a human technique is imposed on a natural component. For example, here, the juxtaposition of feeders, yarns, and pieces of fabric in a technique presents an analogy with the structural parallelism that can be observed in a feeder. One of the most striking examples of this Semperian topic is to be found in the section of style dealing with dyeing, when he relates that, I quote, "The Egyptians even dyed the wool of living sheep with a costly purple, although we are not sure whether they did this with external dyes only or whether the sheep's fodder had an effect as well." This is a marvelous example of the imbrication of nature and art in a very Semperian way. Therefore, Semper's argumentation on polychromy and its textile prototype doesn't lead him to assert that they both have a natural origin, but leads him rather to an anthropological conclusion. The juxtaposition of natural colors is a human artifact. Only human beings create connections between different colors. This is their way to organize nature. Semper opposes the artificial character of parataxis to any conception of an organic origin and a natural fusion of colors. Even the most basic vegetal hedges, in which Semper sees the first form of textile, with their weaving of vegetal fibers, are definitely artifactual. The hedge, as one of the first examples of polychromy, based on the natural diversity of the colors of the stalks, has already to do with what Semper calls style. That's to say, an adequacy with natural materials which doesn't reproduce the natural diversity but organized it in what Semper calls patterns. This is the way Semper summarizes, I quote, the invention of weaving. First, with grass stalks or natural plant fibers. Later, with spun threads made from vegetable or animal stuffs. The diversity of natural color in the stalks soon led to their use in alternating arrangements, resulting in the pattern. I'll come back a bit later to this Semperian definition of style. Now I come to my second part about Semper's conception of the wall and of its function. Power taxis is for Semper more than the formal structure of a polychromy in architecture. For him, it is in a more fundamental way the principle of architecture in general, a principle which he formulates as early as in 1851 in the Four Elements of Architecture. In this text, Semper concludes to a dissociation between the components of architectural constructions. Walls, roofs, and floors are associated with different functions and different practical arts, like textile, carpentry, and masonry. Moreover, these elements of houses or buildings don't work together, but separately. They are independent from each other. In order to demonstrate this idea, Semper logically looks for examples where such a dissociation can be observed. He finds the best illustration of his thesis in ancient Chinese architecture. Semper never traveled to China, but he discovered Chinese building techniques in Paris. Paris as a gate to the Asian world, while browsing the collections of the Bibliothèque Impériale at the end of the 1840s. There, he found a fine manuscript, the Essai sur l'architecture chinoise, brought back from Peking by a Jesuit missionary at the time of Louis XVI, with a great number of hand-colored plates signed by Chinese artists. A beautiful handbook, which is now available on the internet site of the Bibliothèque nationale de France, Gallica. The ancient building principle, or power taxis principle Semper has in mind, has been, I quote, kept alive in China down to the present day. Semper explains in the section of style dedicated to China. I quote Semper, "The elements of Chinese architecture are not linked organically, nor even quasi-chemically, but are held together mechanically without a leading idea. Or rather, the idea dominating the whole is expressed precisely in the separation and independent activity of these elements." In the Chinese house, Semper finds a proof of the legitimacy of one of his most striking arguments, the definition of the wall as, I quote, movable and completely independent of the roof load. In this case, the roof, in the case of the Chinese architecture, the roof is supported by pillars or columns and not by the walls, which don't touch the roof. There is always an empty space between wall and roof. I quote Semper, "In its upper sections, the wall supports only its own load and serves as an infill screen between the wooden supports. The latter served the technical purpose of supporting both the roof and the room's horizontal ceiling. Strictly speaking, the wall itself is a Spanish wall executed in tile, a support for wallpaper. And Semper adds, the interior domestic furnishings are movable. Usually, actual carpets hung on the walls, or woolly lattice work, or wooden panels fastened together with hinges, which can be set up as devised. Sometimes there are fixed screens that allude to the character of these carpets and Spanish walls. Semper's deconstruction of the conventional association between wall and mass or massivity with its specific material, stone, offers a completely new perspective on architectural constructions. I quote Semper, the wall as such, that's the wall as stone construction and as a load-bearing, vertically supporting, statically functioning element appears only in the terraces and foundations that often form massive and essential components of Chinese architecture. Like in this picture, arguing that the first construction or manifestation of the structive impulsion was not the construction of a stone wall, but the hanging of a fabric or carpet, Semper doesn't take over the Vitruvian thesis, according to which the stone wall is a petrification of a wooden construction. Semper's specific argument is the mobility of the first walls and construction, as symbolized in the rug. The hanging rug, in its verticality, reveals the function of the wall. It has to separate a closed space provisionally, to separate the inside and the outside, the inside from the outside, in order to enclose and to protect. Like a viewer, like a skin, the hanging textile in its verticality is a protective barrier against what is now the outside. I quote Semper style, section 9. The need for protection, cover, and spatial enclosure supplied some of the earliest inspiration for industrial invention. Human beings first learned to recognize the essence and purpose of natural covers, shaggy animal skins, protective tree bark, and began to use them for their own ends according to their correctly perceived natural use. Later, they imitated them with synthetic weaving. The concepts of covering, protecting, and enclosing are indissolubly connected with those natural and synthetic covers and dressing that have become the sensible sign for those concepts. As such, they form perhaps the most important element in the symbolism of architecture. The terms sensible signs, concepts, and symbolism are here keys to Semper's argumentation. The protection he refers to is primarily symbolic, and the symbol is more effective in a hanging textile than in the massivity of a stone wall. The function of architecture is above all to symbolize before it even offers physical protection. Architecture, for Semper, is a representation. I quote, The wall is the architectural element that formally represents and make visible enclosed space as such, absolutely. And another quotation, even where solid walls are necessary, they remain only the inner and ancient support for the true and legitimate representation of the spatial idea, which is the more or less artfully woven and knitted textile wall. In my third and last part, which will be very short, I want to make a few concluding remarks about the significance of this symbolic function of architecture in Semper's perspective. So my last part, architecture, textile, and memory. At the end of this presentation, I can't fail to ask two very simple questions related to the Semper's thesis. If architecture really is an inheritance of a textile origin, why don't we live in textile tents or nomadic textile houses anymore? The second question is linked to the first one. If we don't live in textile houses anymore, why do we need a polychrome decor to remind us of the textile origin of architecture? In other words, what is precisely the nature of the relationship of architecture and its original textile prototype? Semper's textile thesis can hardly be demonstrated in a concrete way, since textile is precisely the most fragile and evanescent material. The proofs of the legitimacy of Semper's hypothesis have vanished. But for him, this lack of material evidence is not a problem at all, because he's able to see traces of a textile presence everywhere. Above all, there is one fundamental reason why it doesn't need to find physical evidence. Ultimately, Semper suggests to renounce to the quest for the material core of the architectural decor, to renounce to the quest of what should be under the surface. For Semper, architecture has always been a surface since its textile beginnings. What he calls the principle of dressing, the architectural necessity to dress or to cover the structive parts of the buildings, has been active during all the process of the history of architecture, even in its textile prototypes. When Semper insists on the fact that embroidery is older than tapestry weaving, he suggests again that the principle of dressing, the superposition of a material over another material, is at work even in textile itself and originates in textile itself. The correlate of the paratactic nature of textile is the necessity to dissociate its colored parts, but also the impossibility to dissociate the decor and the elements on which it's dressed. Two materials are associated together as different and discontinuous, but also as inseparable and as necessary to each other. We can now answer the two questions we have just formulated. The differentiation of the material components of architecture the transition between textile and other materials like wood, stone, or concrete is no treason, but the confirmation of the textile principle at work. From the beginning, the opus plumarium has been an association of heterogeneous materials like feathers and silk, for example. The material metamorphosis is the principle of the life of architecture, which connects discontinuous components. At the same time, Semper doesn't describe this metamorphosis as aleatory. There is a logic in the transition from one material to one another. What kind of logic? For Semper, it's not a logic in an evolutionary sense. It's not a succession of materials of increasing solidity, nor a process like the Vitruvian petrification. I would say it's more a logic of reminiscence. The transition from one material to another has more to do with the possibility of an analogy, of a way to represent the preceding material or to allude to it. According to Semper, we have to pay attention to the role of memory in the use of decors, colors, ornaments, and architectural materials. Semper always considers the elements of architecture as reminiscences, as symbolizations of something which is remembered. This architectural memory is constantly linked not to specific events in the history of the people who live in it, but to the memory of architecture itself. It refers to another building material. In this sense, Semper insists on the artistic autonomy of architecture. It never ends to hint at its own past and future, at its own way of transformation from one material to another. What Semper calls style, thus defining it as an art of transition from one material to one another. These material translations are not a marginal phenomenon, they are, on the contrary, absolutely necessary to keep the memory of architecture alive, Semper argues. For him, living memory implies disjunctions, motions in space, recompositions, and, paradoxically, a nomadic status of architecture and of its component. Thank you.
Well, we have been given a lot to think about, especially maybe at the end there. So the floor is now open for questions.
You showed the background album in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Do we know if Semper's discussion of the Chinese architecture was entirely based on his view of this album, or whether he was also exposed to other architecture like Chinoise buildings in European palaces, or how do we know he was exposed to this?
We know this manuscript has a great importance because he quotes it. It doesn't quote the title, but it can be identified. So I think there is no text in this manuscript, only these pictures. And of course, he could read a lot of books on Chinese architecture, but I believe these pictures have played the major role.
Thank you. It's wonderful to hear something that sort of aims to unveil the logic that is beyond all of these different transformations. I want to ask you about your main concept of parataxis, or the paratactic sort of question. Where do you think, first of all, it's something that retains the independence of the several constituents of the form, such as the colors in color composition, etc., and allows the mind to do the synthesis, right? It activates the mind in a way, instead of the hand directing or the color select, etc., etc. I wonder first if, in fact, in architecture we can do this synthesizing itself, or independence remains, right? Or it could be constituted not just by the thing in mind, but the experiencing subject of architecture who walks in and experiences the floor, the wall, the ceiling, etc. Second, with your experience in the history of ideas, do you see any parallel forms in the, say, philosophy or logic of that time that he would have been exposed, that he, because in my experience with Semper, what's original about him is the way that he converts other people's ideas. In a very, he gets ideas from so many other people, Böttcher, Kubler, etc., but he changes them in a very original and unexpected way. So I wonder if you have an idea, how does this independent logical structure, parataxis, which I find very interesting, it sounds kind of linguistics perhaps, that he would be exposed, or logic, philosophy would, any thoughts?
That's a very good question, and I have no answer actually, because I've not found a thinking about parataxis in the philosophy of this time. The only source I've found, which he explicitly quotes, is Chevreul, so a technical book and not a book of philosophy. And I'm still searching for for something like that. But in fact, we could maybe search in books of psychology, maybe of this time, books about the perception. And Semper doesn't make a real parallel between the perception of architecture and the perception of paratactical colors. But I think it insists so much on the dissociation between the parts of architecture that we can make a step more and say that he has a concept of the perception of architecture which is based on a synthesis, like the synthesis of colors. But maybe we should look at psychological treatise about this question.
Just based on where you're concluded, I had a kind of a question about terminology, and that's when the concept of skeuomorphs enters the kind of art historical discourse, because it sounded to me like what Semper was describing is what we might now identify as a skeuomorph, something that retains in its decorative element traces of its earlier structural derivation from some other material or something like that. And secondly, I wondered whether he had other examples of that particular kind of translation in other media, or whether this was his primary example of that, this architectural derivation, kind of reminiscence of origins in textiles, or whether that was something whether that was a kind of relationship he traced out at other scales in other media juxtapositions, translations as well.
Yes, I had not enough time to speak about skeuomorphism, but in Style you can find very nice pages about animal skins and the relationship between furs and architecture or such a lot of things. And so it's a Semperian topic, this skeuomorphism. I could refer to an article of Nathan Schlanger, who wrote about it. It doesn't quote Semper, but it's yes. No, 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 no. But the idea is there.
I'm completely improvising, but I thinking about the translation and the derivation of like the wall architecture as from embroidery, and it's interesting because so much of it is imaginative on his part, not in a sense also that he didn't go to most of those places. And so one thing, I know it's obvious, but in a sense it wasn't said, the whole role of exhibition, it's like the condition for his experiencing so much, right?
Yes, yes, that's obviously.
And so that, I think it's important to also think about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
The roles of the great exhibitions is very important, and of course Semper was in exile, and that was the reason why he could show these exhibitions in Paris and London, and so, and in fact. In these exhibitions, he could see a lot of objects, and so, but every time he is focused on one object. That's like for example, for the Chinese architecture, it's, I believe, this book with these pictures. For the discovery of Oriental palaces and Assyrian sculptures, and so is focused on these codes, the codes of the kings, and he is. It's like an obsession, and he has a very obsessive way of perceiving these discoveries. He focuses on every time on a specific object, and then he is building a theory on this basis. That's his way to do.
Isabelle, can I just pick up on the word exile and ask a roundabout question? So when you ended with this idea of style as an art of memory, and then implying its disjunctions, its motions, its recompositions, the whole, dare I say, Nachleben, without mentioning the man's name itself. But then you said just before that this pointing the function of style is within architecture itself, right? And I'm wondering what kind of history this is that has no people in it. And I'm thinking, so the exile point is he's in exile writing all this stuff. And I was thinking of Peter Green's observation about Braudel's history, written in the 1930s, which de-emphasizes the role of agency, even though all around him agency was at work changing his world. So does this kind of history that Semper is writing reflect his lack of agency as an exile?
Maybe, maybe. Yes, but it's really, as you have said, an history of architecture without people. But people are needed to have style, and Semper can distinguish between absence of style and presence of style. And presence of style means precise people. So
is this in fact the same ambiguity that you have in Warburg, where there is a perpetuation of certain motifs, but there's no focus in his work on the actual ways in which that happens? That's sort of left for our imagination.
Yes. It's an anonymous translation.
Space. I don't think he would even have the formulations of Ecole, etc. if he was not in exile. I don't think you can start thinking about space if you're not out of space. It was a very violent approach. All of this, there are social spaces, but I mean, the heart is the center of social enclosure. So all of these very social understandings of space, I think, are consolidated at that point where he's radically, outcast.
My question or observation has a few tentacles. One of the things that amazed me about Semper's system is the consistency, but also a very functionalist kind of end. Even the way he thinks through the notion of memory is a very functionalist one. And I wonder, and it almost that he begins to think about architecture when the human exits the cave. So I guess my first question is to do with, was he at all influenced by Rousseau's thinking? And secondly, what do you think if Semper would have had knowledge of cave paintings? Because that sort of reverses a little bit the origin of polychromy.
Yes.
On the influence of Rousseau, it was when I began to work on Semper, I believed that there must be a relationship between Semper and Rousseau for political reasons, because Semper, as a revolutionary, should have a link to Rousseau. And I believed that the Semper's insistence on the wall, the topic of the wall, had to do, and the hedge, had to do with a famous text of Rousseau, the first Discours sur l'origine de l'inégalité, when Rousseau says, when the first person who said, this belongs to me, it was the first invention of inequality. And so I was convinced that Semper referred to this text, and that his insistence on the topic of the age had to do with Rousseau. But I had a deception. In fact, I think he didn't know this text of Rousseau, and there is no political connotations in Semper's text about the hedge and the wall. In fact, the wall is not a political barrier. The wall and the wall is not a symbol of property. The wall is only a symbol of spatial separation between inside and outside. So it was a deception for me, like for you, maybe. But there is no reference to Rousseau, in fact, by Semper. And for your second question, there is in the book Style, there is a section about India and about the paintings, the old paintings in India. So Semper knew that the existence of very old Asian wall paintings in the in caves, yes. And also of the, for example, he speaks of the architecture of the earliest Buddhist temples in caves, so with sculptures too. So he knew about it.
Thank you so much. I wanted to get away from the specifics of his ideas about walls, which are fascinating, and obviously have those origins, and come back to the question of what kind of architectural history he's doing. And you mentioned at various points in your talk a kind of an opposition between, let's say, the Vitruvian idea of stone architecture, in a sense all of architecture is being a petrification of a wooden type of architecture. And it just makes me wonder, is that distinction very important for Semper himself? And what kind of architectural history, if he's rejecting that idea, that kind of genealogy for architecture, what do you think that represents for him? Is he taking issue just with that idea, or is that notion of how architecture began, is it emblematic of a different kind of historical thinking that he wants to reject? I'm just trying to, in a sense, put him in some company with other people who are thinking about very early origins. I'm trying to think, well, what is the absolute most primitive and from which what we have today develops? So even not just Vitruvius himself, but people like Loger who are thinking about what is architecture? Not the forms, not the beams and the triglyphs and all that stuff, but what fundamentally is architecture? Where is Semper seating his idea of history and how to do history in relationship to those?
I think by Semper, the topic of the Caribbean hut, which is very famous, has to do with the model of Vitruve. So it's an allusion to the Vitruvian model, and the difference is that Semper insists on the discontinuity. His model of the primitive building, this Caribbean hut, is insisting on the discontinuity of the parts, on the mobility of the parts, and so I would say the difference between the model of the petrification is that Semper postulates the structural necessity of for architecture to remain in this mobility on a symbolic way, but this mobility remains very important, and that's a big difference in a symbolic way.
I have two questions, Nick and then Gottfried.
I'm wondering, did he ever architecture in terms of mobility and disjunction and sort of transition to what was happening around him? Was he making comments on like the adoption of steel or glass architecture in any way?
Glass architecture, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, Semper was an architect, so he didn't. After his exile, he couldn't build many constructions, but architecture of glass was, of course, very important. Already by Hittorf, it was a model for him too, and the principle was the use of stain the possibility of having a glass architecture was founded on the use of stained pillars. It was, of course, a way to make this dissociation between walls and roof. So he was very interested, of course, in these models of architecture, like the construction of Hittorf in the Place de la Concorde, and so yes.
Before, because I had similar, so it was a similar direction. You mentioned a few times Vitruvius and the problem of petrification, and clearly Semper's work is strongly taking a position against this. But I was wondering, why was then classical architecture or classical polychromy at all needed in his own argument? Because he could have told the whole story about memory in architecture, starting with, you mentioned nomads briefly, and non-Western architecture, China, Assyria. In the genesis of his own ideas, was really actually polychromy the starting point, or did he include that to cause controversy?
Can you please repeat, because I...
Genesis of his work, his ideas, whether the polychromy debate was really the starting point, or was it more Assyrian reliefs and a history of non-Eurocentric architecture, which is based on diffusion and memory, rather than the evolutionist idea of petrification in architecture, which derives from Vitruvius? Can we actually distinguish that, or is the starting point of polychromy in classical architecture included as a starting point for quite a deliberate point of provocation?
Of course, by example, there is always a tone of provocation. So, but I believe that polychromy is really the starting point. But polychromy is, for Semper, synonym of an Oriental influence. His way to explain what is polychromy is completely Oriental. And of course, he was really aware of the connotations of these Oriental references. That's obvious when we read him. So it was a provocation too, of course.
How was terrific? How was this work received? I ask because it's not. One could think it was going to be a practical book of architecture, but it's more dolce and side towards feathers and Nineveh and wall hangings and all. How did his peers accept this book when it came out, or this piece when it came out?
He has a lot of students, and
Did they adore it?
yes, of course. And if finally he could find a place in Switzerland where he taught, and there he has a lot of students who were enthusiastic about.
And were practical architects appalled?
Yes. And we have traces of this teaching because the students left a lot of notebooks, and these notebooks are now published for a part. Tomorrow I will speak about it. That's very interesting to see.
One last question.
I haven't dealt with in a long time, but wasn't he in an important advisory position for the 1857 exhibition? And so my point there, as I recall, he also writes things very sensitive to industrialization and to And so coming back to a question of the contemporary architecture and steel skeletal construction and glass, in a way it also makes the whole focus on polychromy interesting, or I don't know if it's paradoxical or what, but he was very much of his time in terms of architecture. So it's fascinating to see this whole aspect of him, you know?
Yes. He was in London at the time of the Great Exhibition of 1851. Yeah, 1851.
No, that's one, but I think also the Manchester exhibition, I think.
No, he was not anymore in England at this time. And there is a book of Semper that I haven't quoted. It's called Science, Industry and Art. That's the text where this topic is very explicit. So I hadn't time enough to quote all his texts. But,
Last question.
Yeah, something that I was interested in, you were talking about this idea of the weaving and the textile, and I was reminded a little bit of a slightly, later person who's also writing about the importance of textiles and weaving, and that is Riegel.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether there's also the craft aspect of weaving that's so, again, antithetical to the idea of glass and steel and the kind of the buildings, the Semper offer, the buildings that he actually survived of his work. Was this another form of rebellion to sort of try to go back to weaving and craft and the idea of the reeds being woven together? That quote, I was struck by that. I mean, I don't know. Yes, of course he may have been influential, but was he actually teaching? Was that a teaching tool for his students? Talk about this.
yes.
Did he weave in his classes?
Yes, we have to wait to the edition of these notebooks to see. But the fact is that Semper's style stops at the time of the Renaissance. So every considerations about modern architecture are only in his in the traces of his teaching. All his demonstration stops at the beginning of the modern times. So we don't have many texts about modern architecture. Only a few traces in these notebooks.
We're going to have to stop here, I'm afraid. But if, like me, you will leave this room feeling like you want more Semper, you're in luck. Because tomorrow afternoon, Professor Kalinowski and Professor Spyros Papapetros will give us a quick overview in little more than an hour of Semper studies today. So if you haven't gotten your fix yet, come back here middle of the day tomorrow. And we'll see you then. But first, let us thank Professor Kalinowski for tonight.